Get full episodes of The Damage Report as a podcast on iTunes and Android, and you can watch the live show every weekday on YouTube TV. So we've got a new House, they're being sworn in, but what are they gonna do with their new power? Joining us to help break it down, Rio Tazewell, Government by the People campaign manager. Rio, welcome to the show.
Thanks, yeah, great to be here.
Very glad to have you here to help break down the legislative priorities of this new House majority. So we, about a month and a half ago, got an idea without specifics really of what H.R. 1 is going to include. Could you break down some of the major components of it?
Sure, so it's a very broad pro-democracy reform package that includes some really important pillars for creating a better and more transparent and equitable democracy, including campaign finance reform, regulating the influence of big money in politics, protecting and expanding the right to vote, as well as ethics and anti-corruption reforms to ensure that our elected officials are behaving ethically while in office and afterwards.
So I want to break down basically all of the different components that you just mentioned, but in terms of priorities, what the Congress does as its first act is obviously symbolically quite important. I know the previous House, the Republican House, had sort of tax changes as their first act, which I think is perfectly symbolic. Why do you think that the Democrats decided to start off with voting rights, anti-corruption, that sort of thing, as opposed to one of their other legislative priorities?
Well, I think the Democratic Party is very aware of the fact that people of all political stripes are very frustrated and frankly appalled by what we're witnessing now from this administration, but also going further back. I mean, it's no surprise that many people are very disillusioned with government and feel that our elected representatives aren't always serving their constituents' interests and are very much beholden to wealthy and powerful interests, corporate interests, et cetera. And that these reforms are popular, and indeed they are. There's polling that shows that there's an overwhelming amount of people across the country that want to see this type of thing happen. And honestly, there's been Democrats pushing for these types of reforms for a long time now. It has yet to really rise to the top in terms of priorities, just given the fact that there's so many competing interests, healthcare, tax reform, et cetera. But now we're at a point in American history where the need for anti-corruption reforms and pro-democracy reforms is so crystal clear, particularly given the atrocious things that we're witnessing from the Trump administration, that it's really risen to the top to get top billing. So it's literally H.R. 1, the first piece of legislation introduced in the House.
Okay, so why don't we dive into it? I mean, one of the priorities here at TYT is campaign finance reform. So what are the components having to do with that in the bill, and how significant of reforms are these?
So the campaign finance piece is one of the most important parts of the bill. It's going to include a system of public financing of elections so that average individual people that don't have a network of wealthy people to collect large checks from can effectively fundraise and mount a competitive campaign. So it'll be a dollar for dollar match. There's a ratio. The final language is going to get worked out in committee over the next few weeks, but it'll basically be modeled after the Government by the People Act, which Congressman Sarbanes has been championing for a while now. And it's going to follow a lot, very much along the lines of other public financing programs which exist in cities already. So that'll allow people to really basically raise money from their communities and have the government match it at a ratio depending on the race, depending on the state, et cetera, so that they can compete with candidates that do take special interest money in large amounts.
So in terms of elections, I know that there are components having to do with shoring up the Voting Rights Act, which obviously was dealt a pretty big blow a few years back, and some changes in terms of registration. What are some of the standouts in those areas?
So one of the most important pieces in terms of voting rights is that it'll reinstate the Voting Rights Act that was essentially repealed in 2013 with a Supreme Court decision, which basically allowed for states that had been basically overseen to basically make new laws regarding voting rights, and it has allowed for essentially discrimination, particularly against people of color. I believe it's 10 states that were previously held to a higher standard. because of a history of discrimination in 2013. Since 2013, they've been able to basically enact these new voter ID laws and other forms of voter suppression. And this bill will basically reinstate those oversight protocols that had been established previously with the Voting Rights Act. But there's other components that are probably going to get worked in to modernize the voting process and basically make it easier for people to participate at the ballot box.
Has there been any debate about a national voter holiday or anything like that?
There certainly is people suggesting that, and it could make its way in. The bill is going to go through committee. It's going to get marked up, and any number of amendments could be added. And I think that's a great idea. There's a lot of great ideas in terms of what can be done to make voting more accessible, and frankly, just get more people doing it. Given that turnout is really a real problem in this country, and we could probably really address that by just making it easier for people to vote. So I think an election day holiday is one of many great ideas that can further that aim.
I agree. So moving on to those who are already in office, as you alluded to, people look at a lot of these elected politicians and they see them as corrupt and beholden to their donors and all of that. In terms of ethics reforms, I know that that's another big part of this bill. How significant are the changes in terms of what ability these representatives are already in office in terms of what they can get up to?
So the ethics piece is quite significant, and there's a lot of different moving pieces, naturally. But one of the main parts is that people in office will have to divest from companies or industries where they have oversight, and if they're able to influence the rules on an industry that they're invested in, then that's a clear conflict of interest. And this bill will address that. Another thing that it's going to tackle is the revolving door. Here in Washington and really state capitals all across the country, we have this phenomenon where people serve in elected office for a period of time and then go and become a full-time lobbyist, and they're basically able to just cash in on their connections. And that's really a big part of why special interests and corporate interests are able to get so much of what they want, because they hire retired elected officials to come and work for their offices and basically use their networks to advance their interests on Capitol Hill and in state capitals. So the ethics provision, the anti-corruption provision of H.R. 1 is also going to address that pervasive problem of the revolving door.
So one final question. I mean, obviously things can change, there could be amendments, but there is going to be a requirement that presidents or presidential candidates reveal tax returns as a component of this as well.
Yes, that will also be a provision that's currently in the bill, and we'll see if it makes it into the final version. But clearly, that has become a major issue with this particular administration and this president. That hasn't been an issue in the past, but it is at this point, and that alone would give us a huge amount of transparency in terms of the level of corruption that we're witnessing with this administration.
And hopefully can do something to rebuild the Americans' trust in their elected officials.
Indeed.
Well, Rio Tazewell, thank you so much for joining us and helping break down the bill. There's obviously a lot of components, but I think you explained it very well, so thank you. Rio Tazewell, People for the American Way. Thank you very much for watching this clip from The Damage Report. If you liked it, don't forget to subscribe to this channel and ring the bell on YouTube to get notifications of our new videos. And of course, you can catch the full Damage Report live every weekday at 1 p.m. Eastern, 10 a.m. Pacific on TYT Network on YouTube TV.